You may launch when ready. Well, not quite. We still have to finish the launch tube. Well, hey everyone, and welcome back to another Interstellar Modeler. So I'm ready to get started here with part 2 of my Galactica launch tube. Again, this is a 3D printed project. All the files can be found on Thingiverse. The links are below, and they are available to you for free. Now, I wanted to get you caught up on a couple of things here before I get started. First of all, I'm happy to note there are more parts available for this project, courtesy of builder Marc Fraley. If you recall, at the end of last video, he was kind enough to design that launch ramp, which replaced the one that came with the original file, and did such a great job with that. He actually ended up going on a designing frenzy and ended up coming up with more parts for the area around the Viper. Let me just take a minute to show you what he's come up with. So first, a reminder of what the original file came with. I have already built, of course, the launch tube, but I'm now replacing all of the area around where the Viper sits with the pieces designed by Marc. So in addition to the ramp that I showed you in the last video, Marc has now designed these beams that can be used for the sidewall, and this piece, which is for the back wall, along with this other one that can be used for a forward wall that would either rest against the entry port of the tube or replace it entirely. So just a big thank you for Marc for designing those pieces. He plans to design a few more things for this build, so we'll just have to wait and see what else he comes up with. Now, a couple of reminders now of what I'm planning to do with my project here. If you recall, I am going to be using this display, and I really do want to stick with this. One of the reasons is simply because I'm just running out of display space. I originally designed all of this to fit into here, and I really would like to stick with that. Now, had I known that I was going to be putting more pieces here, I probably would have cut the launch tube by one section, but because everything is together, that is not an option now. So let me just take a minute to show you what the plans are now for the pieces. I'm going to show you the pieces I have printed, as well as just give you some details again about lighting. Well, first the launch ramp, which I did make one modification to. You'll see these two additional pieces, and this was constructed and scratch built first by taking some insulating foam and then gluing some styrene pieces around that, and on top of that I glued some additional strips of styrene to add in the detailing that you see here. The reason that I added this is because when you Google launch ramp or Galactica launch ramp, there are a couple companies that made some resin kits that allowed you to create a launch ramp as a display base. And at the back end of the launch ramp, you see these two additional pieces that rest on top of it. And I'm assuming there's something that will move the Viper into the launch tube. I'm not sure, but I thought they looked cool, and so I decided just to scratch build my own and added those on there. Now the back piece, when I first printed this, was blank here. Marc was kind enough to create a file that would have added the detailing here, but since I was already cutting strips of styrene for this, I decided to add the detailing by doing the same on the back side here. And these are the beams that Marc designed as a sidewall that go on the starboard side of the fighter, and they're going to be placed about right here. And I had to print these in 3 different pieces. Now I use a program called Mesh Mixer, which I know there's a lot more applications than what I've used this for, but I've been able to learn how to split pieces apart so that I can put them onto my build plate without shrinking them any further. But you can see it's coming off the printer here, and then I glued them together using some 2-part epoxy, and they've now been primed with a gray primer. And then this is the back wall piece. So just a quick word here about the forward wall. This is what I printed here from the files, and Marc had designed this based on some blueprints that he came across, and this is supposed to go here. Now again, I am limited in size here, so I ended up using Mesh Mixer to slice off some of the sides here to get it to the proper width, and even at this width it was just a tiny bit too wide, and since I didn't have any more to be able to slice off here, I asked Marc if he wouldn't mind maybe reconfiguring some of this to see if I could make more room here on the sides to get it to position properly. He did give it a shot, and when I printed that one, you know what ended up happening is we ended up shrinking everything down to fit, but also this ended up shrinking as well. So I ended up with an opening here that was smaller than the Viper could even fit through. So I thought that I was just going to give up on this and just do away with that piece and use this for the front of our tube. But instead I gave it one more try and decided to scratch build one, and this is what I came up with. So what I did was I moved the triangles closer together, but rather than going with this opening, I decided to fashion one that was similar to the openings that's seen on our ports here. And that way there's just no question that the Viper can definitely fit through that. So I think that's going to work out well. It's going to position there with the beams that Marc designed on the sides here. And lastly, these are two pieces that I printed using a file that these are girders that are made to be used on a bridge that you can make for an HO scale train set. And so I thought the girders looked interesting because I was actually trying to figure out a ceiling that would go over the area where the Viper is going to sit. And I didn't want something that would obscure the detailing here. So I was just looking around on Thingiverse and came across these, and I thought this would be functional as a ceiling and open enough to be able to allow you to see through them and see the Viper sitting there. So the way this is supposed to work, actually let me go ahead and show you how this is all going to be positioned. The side beams are going to go here, the back wall is going to go here, and on top of that are the girders that are going to be placed here, and the second one is going to be placed on this side. So that's going to leave a space in the middle. The way that the launch tube is going to be lit up, I think I went over this in the last video, is I'm going to be using a strip of styrene that's going to stretch all the way across here and out over the area where the Viper is going to sit. Within that strip, I'm going to be mounting the SMDs I'm going to be using to light each of the sections. If you recall, I'm going to alternate the colors between red, cool white, and red, and then I'll put a cool white one that will shine over our Viper. Okay, so that's basically the plan here, and I'll give you a little bit more detail about how I'm going to be running all the wires for the lighting, but in the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, well, back at the workbench now, and to fill you in on a couple things that I've done here so far. I did add some extra height to the beams here. The reason for that, the launch tube itself was higher than the beams, and the forward wall here is also higher because this matches the height of the launch tube. So that was easy to remedy because all I needed to do was to take these styrene strips here. They're 6.3 by 6.3 millimeters. They're solid plastic strips, and when you glue them on top of here, it just so happens we ended up with the same exact height. So that also needed to be done to the back wall. And now that this is done, when everything is glued together, we'll be able to mount those girders on top of all of this. And everything now is at a nice even height. Okay, so that is done, and I'm going to be applying the final color to those pieces here shortly. The other thing I did, though, was I went ahead and painted the base. And the way I did this was similar to what I did way back with my BB-8 model. That particular stand, I painted a gunmetal, and when you have clear pieces like this, one good way to do this is to first apply a clear primer. I used a plastic coat and then allowed that to dry, and then I applied the gunmetal, and on top of that I ended up applying some flat black. And by doing it this way, you can actually mask over some inconsistencies because sometimes the spray will be a little bit uneven, but that doesn't matter. Once you get your black coat behind that, everything comes out pretty nice. So that's looking pretty good. I also drilled a hole to accommodate our light switch, and so we're going to mount that here shortly. Alright, now even though I did take the time to paint all of this, I am actually covering all of this on top here with some styrene plastic. I figured I'd have a better shot at the pieces adhering to plastic styrene than I would this clear glossy surface. So at least we'll have a nice painted side here, which is really what I was after. And so let's go ahead and measure everything out here. Alright, well, the flooring is all set now, and the reason I didn't do just one long piece of styrene is that I just didn't have one, so that's why I split it up this way. And actually worked out better because it allowed me to detail each area a little differently. I wanted the flooring where the Viper is going to be sitting to look worn and scuffed up, so that's why I used the hairspray and salt technique, and it turned out really well. And so I have a few more things painted now along with these. I've got the beams painted, and I used the same color for the forward wall and the back wall. And for these pieces, I ended up using this craft paint, which I happen to have on hand. I actually ran out of the Vallejo gray paints that I had. So I had this country gray, which actually worked out real well. It's a lighter shade of gray. And for the flooring on this side, I ended up using some of this Ashen Blue so that it looked a little bit different. And for this flooring here, I basically just relied on the primer since most of it's going to be covered. I wanted to darken the center since you have fighters, you know, rushing across here. I figured the heat would scorch up the flooring. So that's why I did it that way. And then I have this piece painted, which I used a graphite gray, also a craft paint as well, that I mixed into my airbrush. And I'm going to be aging this a little bit and weathering it some. And so what I'm going to do next, however, is work on the lighting. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So if you recall, I was going to mount the SMDs on a strip of styrene that would span across the launch tube and over the launch area. I, however, decided instead on mounting them into a tube of styrene. I felt that this would be a better way to conceal the SMDs, and this one measures 6.3 by 9.3 millimeters from Evergreen scale models, and it's large enough to accommodate our SMDs. I marked off where they needed to be positioned and used my X-Acto knife to cut an opening for the SMD. I then used a drill on low speed to make an opening from which the wire would exit from. The SMDs were then placed into position and secured with superglue, and to help with speeding up adhesion, I used a very small amount of Instaset. Now for the wires that are connected to the SMD that lights the launch area, I decided to feed that through the tube and out a hole that I made right next to the one that feeds the first red SMD. I gave this enough time to dry, and all of the SMDs are now securely in place. And just to show you how I secured the push switch, as you can see here, I'm just using 2-part epoxy putty. And the reason I do this is because you are applying some pressure against this push switch, and I don't ever want it to get dislodged, so this is a good way to secure it. And the other thing I like to do is to put some super glue a little away from the switch to secure the wires here and here, and that way when you're manipulating the wires to solder them onto the other connections, you're not pulling on these connections here. Okay, so I've glued on the tube containing all the wires now, and I added a little bit of detailing on the top. So on the back side, we've got now the wires that are coming out of each of these holes. And to make it look a little bit more orderly and to conceal the wires, I created these coverings. This is using a 6.3 by 6.3 millimeter square tube that I used my X-Acto knife to clear away one side, and my miter box to cut them at an angle this way. So the idea is just to create these covers that will slip right over them, and that way you just don't see the wires hanging off like this. So next came the placement of the power source, which I chose to be a 9-volt battery. Now we're obviously tight on space here, but there's just enough room here at the corner to accommodate the battery. So a hole was drilled here for the wires. Once that was completed, it was time to glue the tube onto the base, and I chose 2-part epoxy as the adhesive. When this was set, I attached the forward wall. Then glued on the flooring for the launch area. Okay, so before assembling the walls, I wanted to construct the elevator because that's what this opening is for. If you look at this picture from the TV show, the elevator was rectangular in shape, and it would go up and down. If you notice that behind it are these 2 vertical openings there, those were the openings for a forklift. That's how they hoisted the elevator up and brought it back down again. And so to replicate that look, I just took some styrene plastic, as you see here, just cutting some bits and pieces. I had this ribbed piece of styrene here that I'm using for the design on our elevator. And so I came up with this piece here, and then for the back of the elevator, or that wall, I'm going to be using this piece of styrene, which I've marked off now. I'm going to use my X-Acto knife to separate these pieces out. These 2 end pieces are going to glue onto our supports. These tubes are going to go here and on the opposite beam. And this side and this side will be glued to those supports, while the middle piece here will be glued to our elevator, so we'll definitely have 2 openings here and here. Behind this, I'm going to put one other piece of styrene that's going to be painted black, so we can have those dark slits or openings in the back. Well, so given the small amount of room that we have here, I think this turned out pretty well, and I really wanted something to fill that in. And when placed into our diorama, I think that's going to work great. Alright, so definitely in the final stretch now of our project. I've done some weathering now to the launch ramp. I've weathered a little bit the sidewall. Didn't want to do too much of this, but I used a Tamiya weathering kit to add a little dirt and grime here and there. And also did the same with the back wall. So what's left with that is really just assembly, putting that together, and I do intend on adding a few figures, which I will go over in the final review. And lastly, the Viper now is all set here to assemble. I use my airbrush to apply a light gray to the ship as a base color, and use Vallejo's steel for the engines here. Use my airbrush along with Vallejo's orange red to apply the striping. And what's left now is just to do some weathering before I assemble this, and I'm not really going to go too much into this because it's just basic stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and get all that taken care of, and I will show you the completed project here in just a second. Okay, so here we now have the completed Battlestar Galactica launch tube, and it's a replica of what was seen in the original series. With the exception of a little scratch building here and there, this is a 3D printed model, and is yet another example of what 3D printing has made available to the hobbyist. It wasn't that long ago we could only have imagined something like this available to us modelers. This diorama was scaled down to fit into this display case which I purchased at Hobby Lobby. The case was designed to display die-cast trucks and cars, and measures a little over 15 inches in length. Although the files, when printed at 100%, were designed for the 132 scale Viper models by Mobius and Monogram, I chose to size it down and fit into this display because of my limited display space. It just so happens that this ended up being 187 or HO scale when completed. All of the files that made this possible are available on Thingiverse, and the links are provided below. You can download them there for free. Okay, let's go through the different sections of the diorama. The tube was designed by LJB Engineering, or LJ Beng, on Thingiverse, and he did a great job with coming up with a reasonable facsimile of the miniature. His file includes the tube and parts for the launch area, and when I started, I had in mind to include all of the parts from his file in my build, but ended up just using the tube. In my build here, the tube consists of 4 sections and measures 8 inches long. Now, the reason I decided on 4 sections partly had to do with the display space that I had here, but I also wanted to get this view as you look down the tube. I really love how it shrinks down in the distance from this perspective, and how you see the tiny Viper at the very end. I felt the 4 sections provided a decent length to give this illusion of a long tube, and I think it hit the mark. So again, the launch area is included in LJB's design, but after looking at reference pictures, I decided to go in a different direction and try and recreate a more accurate launch ramp. My first thought was to scratch build one, but before doing that, I contacted my friend Marc Fraley, who agreed to give it a go at coming up with a file for printing the ramp. And he did not disappoint. His design was spot on and printed beautifully. I added onto the ramp by scratch building these back pieces, and together they make a nice replica of what was seen on the show. Marc went a few steps further by creating the side, front, and back wall, and he's a stickler for detail for sure. The beams he designed for the sidewall even have the rivets. Now again, all of Marc's files can be found on Thingiverse, and he has been at work creating additional pieces for this type of project. I had to refrain from using some of his later pieces because of the constraints of my display here, but if you allow yourself more room, you'll have more available to you. Now, an idea that occurred to me that I thought would add dimension to the back staging area here was this mirror. At first, I thought of putting a picture or even contemplated drawing a background, but then I came up with the idea of using a mirror. Thanks to my wife, who, after running this idea by her, found this highly reflective plastic on Amazon. It had great reviews, and once you took the protective cover off, it was just the thing I was looking for. A couple of really nice advantages: it is very easy to cut since it's made of plastic, and unlike glass, it weighs nothing. It has an adhesive on one side, so I simply attached it to a piece of styrene cut to the right proportions, and that is what was ultimately glued onto the beams. So when looking at it from this side, it appears that there's another Viper sitting right next to it. The Viper you'll find various files for of the original series ship on Thingiverse. I chose this one by designer Misu Bisu because it allowed me to separately print the fuselage, engines, and wings, and this made it super easy for printing and painting. To weather the Viper, I used the Tamiya weathering kit along with the MiG Ammo Starship wash. Since the Viper is seated on the launch ramp, I refrained from adding any extensive weathering or detailing to the underside of the wings, which required supports when printing. The striping was easily done using my airbrush, and the windows were hand painted in. Since the windows are nice and deep, the paint easily pooled into each section, resulting in fairly clean lines. What also makes this Viper stand out is that it is a two-seat design, which no models for exist. Although this was mainly seen in the much maligned Galactica 1980, I thought it was cool to have a non-commonly seen variant of this iconic ship. So taking that to one extra level here, I always thought it was interesting that Captain Apollo was able to take Adama down to Caprica after the attack from the Cylons in his ship. And of course, when we saw the ship landed on the surface, it was a single-seat configuration. So I'm just taking some creative license here and instead depicting that two-seater ship that he would have used to take him down to the surface, and that's what we see here. Adama is waiting for Apollo to come around the corner here, and he's accompanied by his friends Boomer and Starbuck already waiting at the fighter prior to heading down to the planet's surface. Lastly, I think the girders that I chose for the ceiling here work well. They fit into the design great, cast some nice shadows from the lighting above, and they add to the overall look without obstructing the launch area. These were created using a file for girders for an HO train bridge, and it was nice that I didn't have to resize them since my diorama was already a 1/87 scale. The link for this is also below. And as for the figures, these were also found on Thingiverse, and just like the others, the link is below. These figures measure 20 millimeters in height, and I just used different colors to paint on the uniforms and did the best I could to replicate what was seen on the show, even making Apollo left-handed. So the diorama was lit with 4 mega-size SMDs from evandesigns.com, and I had to create some pieces for holding them in place. This was easily done using a 6.3 by 6.3 millimeter rod from Evergreen scale models, and I'm very pleased with the results. Placing alternating colors along the panels in the tube helps to replicate the look we saw on the show. As you can see, this enhances the view down the tube quite well. I chose to light up the launch bay with a single cool white SMD, and this works great to shed some light on the Viper and the action going on in this section. Okay guys, well that is a wrap for this project. I hope you enjoyed following along. It certainly was fun to put this together and an interesting project to work on. Yet another example of what 3D printing has added to our hobby. A couple comments here before we wrap up. One of the things I end up noticing as I do these final reviews, as I zoom in on things, I start picking up all these imperfections. I realize most of those probably aren't going to be very noticeable since you do look at things from a farther point of view. But that seam down the middle of that step ramp did bug me. This was the last thing I did put together. You have to assemble it in 2 halves, so you're left with that seam in the center. I didn't want to do away with a lot of detailing on those steps, so I kind of did the best I could to get them aligned and left it at that. So I may end up reprinting that. I also may end up using a different version of it. I know LJB has designed a couple other versions. This is one of them that I had to modify. I did have to shorten things because of the space constraints here. And also Marc Fraley, I know he's been working on one, and he may end up providing a file for a different version as well. So we'll see. The other thing I want to make mention of is when you look at the pieces here used for the tube, this isn't a 100% accurate representation of what was seen on screen. You know, Marc, when he does research for his STL files, he really dives into things, and he was sending me pictures of the pieces that were used here, and it certainly does look different. However, I'm quite content with what we have here. I think LJB did a fantastic job designing a file that you can easily print out, and you know, also consider the fact that the launch tube was a big blur to most of us as we saw the Viper, you know, rush across it on screen, and it wasn't really seen on screen for very long, so that does not bug me. I think I'm very content here with what I ended up with, and I think you will too if you end up using these files. Lastly, I was, of course, really determined to fit everything into this display because I am display space challenged in my office, and I'm very happy with the way everything turned out. We have a nice replica here that has a cover to it that's going to keep the dust off. If you were to print this at full size, which as I mentioned a number of times in this video, it's designed to fit those 132 scale Vipers, you're going to end up with quite a large display, which would be epic and very stunning, no doubt, to display, but I know I don't have the room for that. Again, also this kind of limited me on what I could do here with the launch bay area or the staging area. If you want more room, as I mentioned early on in the video, one thing you could do is eliminate one of these sections. I'm not sure you'll miss much on that if you did that, but that would provide you more room to display things, because I realize everything is crunched together because of that. But overall, I'm very happy with the way everything turned out. Alright, you guys, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me here on my YouTube channel or at interestedinmodeler@gmail.com. Coming up on the channel will be another edition of Hot Off the Bench in a couple weeks. I'm just gathering things together for that. I think you'll be very pleased with the slideshow I am going to be showing in that video. Alright, thanks again, you guys, and I also want to let you know that I appreciate all the great comments you guys leave with every video that I post on a video, so thank you very much for that. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.